Welcome to the Stoic Inspire. If you're here, it means one thing. You're not settling for noise, distraction, or autopilot living. You want depth. You want truth. You want to live as a man who responds with clarity, not impulse. And that journey doesn't begin with what you say. It begins with what you learn not to say. Because here's a truth the world rarely teaches. The wisest men I've met, the truly grounded, centered ones, they aren't remembered for how much they speak. They're remembered for what they wish to say. They know that silence, discipline, and self-control carry more weight than any clever quote. So today, we're exploring 7 things intelligent men never say. Not because they're flawless, but because they've learned, often through pain, that some phrases cost too much to be worth speaking. Let's begin. 1. I already knew that. Few phrases shut down growth as quickly as this one. I already knew that. It rolls off the tongue like confidence, like control. But underneath, it's often fear. Fear of appearing like a beginner. Fear of being wrong. Fear of letting go of the illusion that you already have it all figured out. Years ago, I learned this lesson the hard way. I was working under a mentor, an older man, with that rare kind of quiet certainty. He didn't speak to impress. He spoke like someone who'd buried more egos than he'd ever inflated. One day, he began explaining a process I had done dozens of times before, and without thinking, I cut him off. Yeah, I already know that. He didn't argue. He didn't scold. He just paused, looked at me with a calm disappointment, and moved on. Later that night, I sat with the weight of what I had done. I hadn't just interrupted a man. I had interrupted wisdom. Wisdom shaped by scars, by failures, by years I hadn't lived through yet. And I threw it away, not because I knew better, but because I wanted to look like I did. That's what this phrase really is. A shield the ego hides behind. Because the moment you say, I already know that, what you're really saying is, I've decided there's nothing new for me here. And that is not intelligence. That is arrogance, dressed in the costume of competence. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher and emperor, wrote, "If someone can prove me wrong and show me my mistake, I will gladly change. I seek the truth, and the truth never harmed anyone." That is what wisdom looks like. Not needing to be right, but the courage to become right. I once watched an old carpenter, hands like leather, sit through a young apprentice explaining a technique he probably mastered decades ago. He nodded. He asked questions. He even thanked the boy. I asked him why. He said, "Because every time someone explains something I already know, I see something I missed. That's the kind of man I now aim to be. Not the one who interrupts, but the one who listens, again and again. Because growth is a lifelong commitment." So, the next time you feel that impulse rise, that urge to say, I already knew that, pause, breathe, and ask yourself honestly, is this confidence? Or is it fear? Because the man who keeps learning, even from the familiar, doesn't just grow smarter, he becomes wiser, too. That's impossible. It doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It whispers, quiet, logical, defeated. That's impossible. It sounds like reason, like caution. But most of the time it's fear wearing a suit. Fear of trying. Fear of failing. Fear of stepping into the unknown and not looking strong while doing it. I remember a man I once worked with. Let's call him Robert. Sharp, respected, the kind of guy whose calm made chaos seem manageable. But there was a pattern in him. Every time someone brought up a bold idea, a new venture, an untested market, a risky opportunity, he'd shake his head and say the same 2 words. That's impossible. Not in frustration, not even with emotion. He said it like gravity, like a law of nature. But over time, I realized something important. The things he was labeling impossible weren't actually blocked by the world. They were blocked by his mindset, by the limits he had placed on himself. The Stoic philosopher Seneca warned us long ago, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality," and Robert's imagination had built walls around every path forward, not out of malice, but out of fear disguised as realism. I almost repeated that mistake years later. I was handed a project with a laughable budget, a tight deadline, and a team that had never worked together. I nearly said it. This can't be done. But something stopped me. Instead of focusing on everything out of my control, I asked myself a different question. What's one thing I can do today? Just one task, one small step, one clear win, then another, and another. That project became one of the most successful I've ever led. Not because we had secret weapons, but because we didn't freeze. We moved. Marcus Aurelius said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That's the Stoic response to impossible. Not denial, not delusion, discipline. The intelligent man doesn't need perfect conditions to take action. He just needs motion, even if it's small, even if it's clumsy. Because when you say, "That's impossible," you're not defining the problem. You're defining yourself. So the next time your mind reaches for that phrase, pause. Ask instead, what can I influence? What's one step I can take right now? What if I just try one more time? Because strength isn't found in certainty. It's built through action. And action, especially when the odds feel against you, that's where Stoic courage lives. 3. That's not my fault. It's one of the most natural phrases to say, especially when things go sideways. A deal falls apart, a relationship crumbles, a plan unravels, and we feel that instinct rise, fast, defensive, automatic. That's not my fault. And maybe it isn't. Maybe someone else did drop the ball. Maybe the timing was off. Maybe you really did everything right. But here's the danger. Every time you rush to defend yourself, you risk giving away your power. Because if you claim none of the responsibility, you also claim none of the control. I saw this play out in a man I once admired. Let's call him Michael. He was sharp, charismatic, always 10 steps ahead. But whenever something went wrong, he had an airtight explanation. The team wasn't aligned. The client wasn't clear. The market was shifting. And every time, he ended with the same line. It wasn't my fault. What he didn't realize was that by never looking inward, he stayed stuck in a cycle. Same failures, different excuses. He didn't grow, because in his story, there was never anything to fix. He had chosen comfort over change, and comfort, unchecked, turns into stagnation. The Stoics didn't preach comfort. They preached responsibility. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." In other words, you don't control the storm, but you always control your sail. I've lived this lesson myself. There was a project years ago that collapsed under my leadership. Deadlines missed, communication failed, and my first instinct? Blame. They didn't follow through. They misunderstood. I did my part. But when I got quiet with myself, when I stripped away the ego, I saw what I had overlooked. I could have clarified the vision more clearly. I could have asked tougher questions. I could have spoken up sooner. And when I owned even a small part of the failure, I unlocked something most men never access: growth. Because that's the hidden power of responsibility. It gives you leverage, not over others, but over yourself. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You always have the option of having no opinion. You don't have to jump to defend. You don't have to explain your side every time. You can pause, reflect, and ask the only question that matters. What can I own here? Even if it's just 1%. That 1% becomes your starting point, your edge, your next level. Because intelligent men don't chase the feeling of being right. They chase the truth. And the truth, no matter how hard, always sets you forward. So the next time you're tempted to say, "That's not my fault," pause, and instead ask, "What did this teach me? Where did I stay silent? How can I do better next time?" Because Stoicism isn't about taking blame, it's about taking ownership. And that is where real strength begins. 4. I don't need any help. This one doesn't sound weak. It sounds strong, independent, solid, even noble. I don't need help. I've got it handled. I can carry this. We wear it like armor, a badge of honor forged in silence, because somewhere along the way we were taught, real men don't ask, they endure. But here's the truth that every wise man eventually learns. Carrying everything alone doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you tired. I know, because I lived it. There was a season in my life where everything looked fine from the outside. Work was steady. Responsibilities were handled. I was the dependable one, the guy others leaned on. But inside, I was fraying at the edges, exhausted, distracted, losing clarity day by day. And yet every time someone asked, "You good?" I smiled and said, "Yeah, I'm good." Because I thought that to ask for help meant I had failed, that needing support meant I was somehow less of a man. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't carrying strength. I was carrying pride. And pride, when worn too long, stops being armor. It becomes a cage. The Stoics warned us about isolation. They believed in interdependence, not weakness, but the kind of strength that comes from walking together. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, wrote openly about the men who shaped him, his teachers, his friends, even his rivals. He gave them credit for his values, his discipline, his character. Imagine that, the most powerful man in the world, publicly acknowledging that he didn't get here alone. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. I think often of Abraham Lincoln too, often pictured as the lone figure leading through darkness. But in truth, he surrounded himself with what historians called a team of rivals, people who challenged him, disagreed with him, made him better. And yet we, modern men, still cling to the myth that asking for help is failure, that strength means solitude, that vulnerability is shameful. Let me tell you something hard and honest. Suffering alone doesn't make you strong. It just makes you quiet. And silence, when it goes on too long, becomes invisible pain. When you say, "I don't need help," what you're often really saying is, "I'm afraid to be seen struggling. I don't trust others to catch me. I'd rather break quietly than risk being vulnerable." But Stoicism invites us to live differently, to remember what Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." And part of that mastery is knowing when to ask. Because sometimes courage doesn't sound like a war cry. Sometimes it sounds like, "I need a hand. I don't have all the answers. I'm not okay right now." And when you say those words to the right person, you don't get judgment. You get strength, connection, clarity. I've learned this firsthand, and I've never once regretted asking for help, only the times I waited too long to do it. So if you catch yourself thinking, "I've got this," pause. Ask yourself, is this strength speaking, or fear in disguise? Am I protecting my image, or protecting my peace. Because wise men don't carry every burden alone. They carry what they can, and they ask for help when they can't. That's not weakness. That's the wisdom that keeps you standing for the long haul. 5. I'm too old for that. It doesn't shout like anger. It doesn't sting like shame. It sighs. I'm too old for that. It slips out quietly, sometimes as a joke, sometimes as an excuse, but always as a slow surrender. Because what that phrase really means isn't about age. It's about belief. The belief that your best chapters have already been written, that you've missed your shot, that growth belongs to younger men with fewer scars and more time. But the Stoics would tell you, age is not a reason to stop. It's a reason to deepen. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "It is not death that a man should fear, but never beginning to live." Think about that. The true tragedy isn't aging. It's stagnation. It's shrinking your life before life has finished offering you opportunities to expand. I once read about a man named Harry Bernstein. He spent most of his life working ordinary jobs, raising a family, living quietly. But at 93 years old, he decided to write his first book, The Invisible Wall. Publishers rejected it again and again, but he didn't stop. At 96, it was published. It became an international success. He wrote 3 more books after that, well into his 90s. He didn't write to be famous. He wrote because he still had something to give, something to become. And that's what this phrase, "I'm too old for that," steals from you. Your unfolding, your potential, your unfinished story. I've known men in their 60s who started businesses, men in their 70s who began mentoring young men and transformed lives, and men in their 80s who painted, wrote, and inspired people half their age. Not because they were chasing relevance, but because they refused to betray their purpose. And I've also known men in their 30s who were already bitter, already tired, already calling themselves too late. The difference? It's not in the years, it's in the mindset. When you say, "I'm too old for that," what you're really saying is, "I've stopped believing I can change. I've decided my time is over. I've accepted the script instead of writing my own." But the Stoic man, he writes until his last breath. Not because he's chasing perfection, but because becoming is the work of a lifetime. Growth doesn't expire, purpose doesn't retire, and meaning doesn't care how many candles are on your birthday cake. So if you ever hear that quiet voice say, "I'm too old for that," pause. Ask yourself, is this really my limit, or just my fear? Is this the end, or the beginning I've been afraid to pursue? What would I do if I believed it wasn't too late? Because the truth is, as long as your lungs hold breath and your heart holds fire, there's still work to be done. That's the Stoic path. To walk with humility, yes, but also with urgency, with purpose, with the unshakable belief that you are still becoming. 6. I'll do it later. This one is quiet, almost gentle. It doesn't sound dangerous. It sounds reasonable. I'll do it later. Not never. Just not right now. But here's the problem. Later is where dreams go to die. Not with a crash, not with a fire, but with a whisper. I once knew a man, Thomas. On the surface, he had it all together. A respected career, a family that loved him. But underneath, he was always too busy. We talked once about his father, an old fisherman, aging fast. Thomas told me, "I want to take him on one last trip, just the 2 of us, like when I was a boy." But work was demanding. There were meetings, projects, life. So he said it, soon. I'll do it later. But later never came. His father passed suddenly. No trip, no goodbye, just an empty chair on a dock that never got used again. And Thomas wasn't crushed by what he did. He was crushed by what he never got around to doing. That's the sting of procrastination. Not just lost time, but lost chances. And you don't realize what's been taken until you have no way to get it back. The Stoics were brutally honest about this. Seneca wrote, "While we are postponing, life speeds by." And Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, "You could leave life right now." Let that determine what you do and say and think. It wasn't morbid. It was clarity. Because when you remember how fragile life is, you stop pretending there's always more time. You stop waiting for the perfect moment. You stop polishing plans that never launch. You start, not because you're ready, but because ready is a myth we hide behind to delay the discomfort of beginning. I've seen it in myself. Moments where I postponed a conversation, a decision, a risk, telling myself I'd act when the time is right. And you know what I found? The right time never came. But the regret did. Because later feels safe, until it turns into never. The Stoic doesn't wait for the stars to align. He acts, not recklessly, but intentionally, urgently. So if there's something you've been putting off, a call you need to make, a boundary you need to set, a dream you keep telling yourself you'll get to someday, stop and ask yourself, if not now, when? What am I really waiting for? What would happen if I just took one step today? Because the man who acts, even imperfectly, builds a life he won't have to apologize for. And the man who delays, he might wake up one day and realize he traded meaning for comfort. Don't let that be you. 7. That's just how I am. It sounds honest, even self-aware. But in truth, it's one of the most dangerous things a man can say. That's just how I am. It feels like acceptance, but more often, it's resignation in disguise. I've heard it in many forms. I've got a temper. That's just how I am. I'm not disciplined. I've always been this way. I don't open up. I'm not that kind of person. These aren't truths. They're defense mechanisms, built to protect comfort, not character. Because here's what you're really saying when you use that phrase. I've stopped trying. I've chosen familiarity over growth. I'm more committed to who I've been than who I could become. But Stoicism doesn't allow that kind of surrender. Epictetus taught, it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. That includes the judgments we make about ourselves, about who we are, about who we can be. And here's the brutal truth. You are not fixed. You are not stuck. You are not a finished product. You are a man in the making, whether you realize it or not. I've lived this. There was a time I told myself I wasn't a morning person, that I wasn't consistent, that I was too blunt to be a good communicator. And every time I repeated those labels, I carved them deeper into my identity. Until one day, I asked a question that changed everything. What if I'm wrong about me? That question opened the door, not to instant transformation, but to possibility. I started changing my habits, bit by bit. And over time, I proved something powerful to myself. I'm not who I was. I'm who I choose to become. That's what the Stoics called self-mastery. Not the fantasy of overnight change, but the disciplined work of reshaping yourself day after day in alignment with virtue. And it's not about hating who you are now. It's about respecting yourself enough not to stay there. Because the moment you declare, that's just how I am, you lock the door. You freeze the story. You surrender your role as the author of your own life. But the Stoic man doesn't fear change. He welcomes it. He knows that who he is not a limitation. It's a launching point. So if you ever catch yourself using that phrase, pause and ask, is this really who I am, or just who I've gotten used to being? Am I protecting myself from growth by clinging to this identity. What would change look like if I believed it was possible? Because the world doesn't need perfect men. It needs evolving men, humble enough to reflect, disciplined enough to improve, and strong enough to leave old versions of themselves behind. That's Stoicism. That's transformation. That's intelligence in action. Becoming the man you were meant to be. If you've made it this far, understand this. You're not just a passive viewer. You're the kind of man who chooses growth over comfort. Because real intelligence, it's not about sounding clever. It's not about collecting quotes or pretending to have all the answers. It's about having the courage to look at yourself, honestly, to question the phrases, the habits, the beliefs that have quietly shaped your life, and to ask, is this helping me become who I'm meant to be, or who I've been told I have to be? The truth is, you don't need to raise your voice to be powerful. You don't need to dominate a room to be respected. And you don't need to be flawless to be wise. You just need to stay teachable, present, disciplined. The 7 things we talked about today, they're not just words to avoid. They're signals, red flags, signs that your standard is either rising or slowly slipping. And if even one of them hit home, good. That's where change begins. Not in shame, but in awareness. Because Stoicism isn't about perfection. It's about radical responsibility. It's about showing up every day, clear, calm, and committed to being better than you were yesterday. So reflect on what you heard. Apply what matters, and live it out. Not just in what you say, but in what you choose to leave unsaid. And if this message spoke to something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Because there's another man out there, just like you, who needs it too. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Not for entertainment, for training. Because here, we don't chase noise. We build men of depth. This is the Stoic Inspire. And brother, you're just getting started.